Hi there, this is Catherine with Unfolded Heart Music. In this video, I'd like to offer some tips and suggestions for improvisation and composition. The things I'm going to be offering are technically applicable for any plucked or hammered instrument, so like the harp, the lyre, the piano, maybe even like the hammered dulcimer or something like that. So if you're interested in composition and improvisation, but you don't play the lyre, this still may offer a few ideas for you or a few things to kind of get you started on it. Before I jump into the particular content, I want to give two sort of disclaimers and two sort of heads up before we jump in. The first, as I've mentioned before, is that I do not have formal training with the lyre. I do not have formal training with improvisation or composition. My formal training was in piano for many years as I was growing up in classical piano. I did do a little bit of composition at that time and worked with my teacher, but that really came out of just a natural desire for me, and then I played it for her, and she gave me feedback, and we moved from that point on. But just a little bit of a disclaimer in that regard. This video is also not intended to give an all-encompassing a lesson or tutorial on composition or improvisation. So I'm sure there are many other videos out there. If that's something that you really want to get into, I'm sure there's people who maybe specifically focus on that skill. But this is for those who already listen to this channel. I've had a few people ask for something like this, and so this is my response to that. Again, if you'd like something a little bit more thorough, then there are other places that would be a better fit for that. The second disclaimer I want to give is that for this video in particular, and perhaps for improvisation and composition, broadly speaking, some music theory background is going to be helpful for you. For me, I can only share my personal experience and how I personally write music. Now, granted, music can be written without music theory, obviously, just like it can be played without music theory. The theory is really just a kind of language to communicate, and a language to understand how music works, and then again, to communicate that to other people. So that's why it's going to be helpful for me in this video to speak with you using some of that language. And also it will be helpful for you, again, if you're really wanting to get into this, to learn, if you don't have background in music theory, very basic stuff, not, super technical stuff, but things like major and minor scales and chords, time signatures, time signatures, and I'm blanking. Key signatures. That took me a while. Time signatures, key signatures, different chords like a third, a fourth, a fifth, an octave, things like that. So it's really, in this video, it's going to be more of a language thing than anything else. But again, if you want to really get into improvisation and composition, it's very helpful to know some of these things so that you can know how to explore music more than you can by ear, most likely. And also so that you can communicate it to other people by writing it out and things like that. So just two things before we get into it. The way I'm going to divide this video up, I'll do it in, I think it'll end up being 5 parts. So the first, I've got just some general tips that I'll go through pretty quickly at the beginning. Then I'd like to talk about time signatures first. The second will be what notes in a particular scale are helpful if you're not even really sure where to start with improvisation. I'll talk a little bit about how I move through the particular scale in a lot of songs, and just something that's very common in music in general. So I'll touch on some of those things. The third is going to be about shifting to different keys without changing the key signature. I'll explain what that means a bit more. And then the last is more specifically for composition, properly speaking, rather than improvisation. And that's just about the structure of a particular piece and how to put different parts together and have it flow in a way that's natural and beautiful. I want to backtrack for just a moment. I did, of course, I just said that music theory is going to be helpful. That does not mean, however, that if you don't have background in music theory, that this video is going to be of zero help to you. I'm sure it would still be very helpful for you, but I did want to give a disclaimer that if you're watching this and you have zero musical background, some of the language I'm going to be using is not gonna be quite as easily accessible, but you can certainly still listen to what I'm playing, get an idea, because again, there's the reality of the music and then there's the language used to express what it is that I'm doing. And so those are two different things. So even if you don't have the language, you could still learn a lot just from listening. So just some thoughts. Okay, so again, I'll go through those 5 parts, and that should finish up the video. As always, if you have any questions, you're welcome to put it in the comments, email me. If you have anything else that you think would be really helpful, you're welcome to put that out. I can't promise that I'll go over whatever is suggested, but it's great to know. It's very helpful to know what is actually helpful and what's maybe not as helpful. So your feedback is something that I do take into consideration, since this is meant for you. So I wanted to actually be attuned and aligned with what you're hoping to learn. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. Okay, so the first thing that I'd like to do is touch on 2 broad suggestions that I would give to anyone who's wanting to get into improvisation or composition. The first is to keep it simple. This is something that is sometimes harder than it sounds, especially if we're just getting started with something. This is true in music writing. I think this also tends to be true in writing in general, like actually, writing an essay for school or a story or something like that. We can try too hard and it makes it more complicated and less beautiful. And so, and now certainly there's something as, something exists as too simple, and that's true, but usually the tendency, because we feel kind of insecure or we are getting really excited and we want to try and do a whole bunch of things in one piece, that it becomes too complicated. And sometimes we can even be tempted to want to make something impressive instead of beautiful, and that doesn't really do a lot of good for anyone. If you're trying to share music with someone, if it's too complicated, they're not going to be able to follow it either as a listener or to learn it as a player. It can be very intimidating, and that kind of defeats the point of music in a lot of ways. Certainly there's a place for sort of showiness. We see that in some classical music, where there's a solo player and they, get to show off their skills. So there's a place for it. But if you're wanting to write beautiful music, it doesn't need to be complicated. I'd actually encourage it not to be very complicated. This will be true for the structure of the piece as well as some of the more nitty-gritty smaller chunks of the piece. If you've watched some of my walkthrough tutorials, you'll notice in certainly Whispers of Beauty and Memories of Home, there's a lot of repetition. And I'm sort of getting ahead of myself now. That's something I'll talk more about at the very end in regards to composing your piece as a whole, the structure as a whole. But don't be afraid to be simple. You can get more complicated if you want to, but I'll explain a little bit more of what's good complexity, what I mean by that more is richness. There's a difference between richness and complexity. Richness is still very beautiful. It's just sort of ornamentation. Or maybe you're playing more of a chorded piece. Complexity is just that it's hard or it's simply complicated, which tends to end up kind of sounding like a mess sometimes. So keep it simple. That's the first thing. The second thing is to not forget to continue to listen to what you're playing. If you are someone who's wanting to write a lot of music, you've probably listened to a lot of music. And so your ear has received a lot of training. If you've listened to good music, not just exclusively kind of pop music, but if you've listened to the kind of music that you want to play, I should put it that way. If you listen to the kind of music that you want to play, your ear has been picking that up a lot. And so it's going to be a great aid for you. But when we improvise or compose, sometimes we try and use our head more than our ears. And again, that can lead into either complexity or a kind of stiffness in the piece. And that comes out in the music itself. It's one of the things I find very wonderful and very beautiful about music, is that you can hear so much even if, for example, it's the same song being played by different people, you can hear if someone is relaxed, or if they're enjoying what they're playing, or if they're feeling really uptight, or just different things like that. You can hear that in the song itself, how it's being played, but also in the song as it's written. So I know for myself, certainly, that particularly when I was first getting started and just trying to do a little bit of composition, it sounded exactly like that. It sounded like I was trying to do composition. And so it was fine, but that's about it. Someone could listen to it and be like, well, that's nice. But it wasn't necessarily beautiful. And it's because my trying was coming out in the piece so much. And so this is where I've talked about this in videos before, but that humility and gratitude, I think, really come in, particularly when you're writing, when you're improving. You have to always be listening. And it can be easy to get stuck in our heads, especially if you're trying to think about different keys or time signatures or something like that. So keep it simple and keep listening. Those would be my 2 suggestions, very broadly speaking, when you're getting into this. So I'm going to close this part, and we're going to go into time signatures in the next part. Okay, in this section, again, I'd like to talk about time signatures. Now, there are many different ways to start writing a piece. For me, I don't know if this is common or really odd. I'm not, or maybe somewhere in between. But in a lot of ways, I actually like to start with the time signature. Now, if you don't know what time signature is, in short, it is the sort of general beat of the song. So, for example, if you're listening to music and you naturally start kind of swaying back and forth, or you start kind of tapping your foot, or maybe you're at some kind of concert or something and you're clapping your hands, there's a natural beat to different songs, and they vary depending on the time signature. So some songs, you naturally feel like, oh, this is a swaying song. Other songs you feel like, well, this is kind of a marching song, or maybe even something like at a pep rally or something, and so you feel more inclined to clap. And so that feel of the song, and I don't mean by the notes that are being played, I mean by the rhythm of it, the pace of the song, that is determined by the time signature. And so I find that very important to start with, and very helpful. When I don't do that, my songs can tend to vary in their time signature, because it's kind of loosey-goosey. Now, there's a place for that. I think when I write, for example, the whistle music or the flute music, they tend to be a lot looser on the time signature, and that is for 2 reasons. One is I'm only playing one note at a time, and 2, it's an instrument where I can play one note and sing with that note. I can do vibrato on that one note. I can, crescendo or decrescendo, whereas with a plucked instrument, you can't do that. You pluck the note and that's it. And so there's more rhythmic stuff that I tend to do with plucked or hammered instruments, the piano or the lyre. So I say there's a little bit of wiggle room there, but I definitely find, especially with my lyre pieces, that I tend to start with the time signature. So I'd like to go through 3 different time signatures very briefly. Again, if you want to have examples of this, or have a little bit more in-depth understanding of what this means, if you're not already familiar with it, I would encourage you to check out some other videos. I don't have any specifically in mind, but I know just by doing a general, YouTube search, that you can find people who explain this, and they do it very well, likely much better than I could do it. So I'd encourage you to look over there. You won't find that in this video. But let me go through 3 different time signatures that are probably the most common ones. There's more than that, but that's getting into a little bit more complexity. So the 3 I'm going to go over are 4/4, 3/4, and 6/8. Okay, I'm actually going to start with 3/4. 3/4 is used usually for waltz music, if that is any help to you. If you're not sure what a waltz is, then I don't know, maybe look that up first. But it has a swaying sense to it. So the feel of this is just 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Even, it just kind of makes you want to sway. It is a little bit usually of a slower song. Not always, but it has a little bit of pep to it. But it's definitely not a march sound, and it's a little bit different from 6/8, which I'll explain in a second. But let me just illustrate what this would sound like and how this applies to improv and composition. So if I want to do something in 3/4, let's see, my lyre is tuned to C major right now. Okay, where's my C? Just so you know where I'm at. Okay, so if I want to do 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3. So that's a little example of 3/4. I'm sorry, my left hand wasn't as consistent as I hoped it would be, but let me just play you a kind of left hand for this. So if you listen to my Lyre pieces, you'll notice in a lot of them the left hand is very consistent, and that's because it is in part setting the time signature for the piece. And that sets the tone for it. I feel like it has a kind of lullaby sound to it, a 3/4 piece. But so I usually set that first and then plug my left hand in, again, with something like this. And what I just played for you, I just made up. That was total improv. I had no idea what I was going to play before then. And it'll be a little bit inconsistent at first with composition, but then you kind of get into it. So let's see if I can be a little bit more consistent with that left hand and give you another example. Again, this is 3/4. Okay, so one suggestion, in addition to the time signature, would be if you're just getting started and you want to compose, do something consistent with the left hand so that it can be on autopilot, and then you're free to just worry about the right hand, but you already have a nice left hand going in there, a little bass going in there. Okay, so that's 3/4 for a moment. Then let's switch to 6/8. Now 3/4 and 6/8. Even I get confused on this. A lot of people get confused on this because they have a similar swaying feel to them. But whereas 3/4 has the strong beat on 1, 6/8 has it on 1 and 4. So rather than 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, what you have for 6/8 would be 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 4 5 6. So you feel a sort of double. It's almost sort of twice as fast, but it's not just a difference of speed, though that's part of it, which you could maybe guess because 6/8 and 3/4. It's just 3 times 2 is 6, 4 times 2 is 8. But they're usually used for different kinds of music. Now you can have in one piece them switching back and forth between the two, so it sounds something like 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 4 5 6. So that actually illustrates right there the difference between the two. Now, how does that sound? What I usually use for 6/8 is something like I used in Whispers of Beauty. Yeah, let's stick with the same one. So instead of, excuse me. What you have more something like, let me find, sorry I didn't place my right hand. So 6/8 also has a very, I don't know, a very lovely feel, like a nice spring day kind of feel. But it's a little bit more peppy. It's a little bit more like a walk in the park. Whereas 3/4 has a little bit more of a lullaby feel to it. That's sort of my take on it. That's my how I would describe the difference between the two. Now those are the most similar. Okay, so we have 3/4, 6/8, and then there's 4/4. Now this has a more of a marchy sound. What I mean by march is like you know, like if an army is marching and you have a band playing with it. You'd usually have something in 4/4 because it has a little bit more of a straight feel, a little bit more. Sometimes it can be a stiff feel, not always, but it has a little bit of a different feel. You won't have usually a song going from 3/4 to 4/4 or 6/8 to 4/4. That would be very awkward, and it would be quite startling to the listener. Imagine you're like clapping along with the song, and then you keep clapping, and you realize, wait, something changed. I'm like not even with the song anymore. And are you listening to it in the car, you know, and you're kind of swaying back and forth, and you're sort of really into it, and then all of a sudden it like changes. It's very even on a sort of gut felt level, it can be very off-putting and very startling. So, I mean, if you want that in your piece, then I suppose there's probably theoretically a place for that. But if you're wanting to write just simply beautiful music or more simple music, then it's not something I'd recommend. But, okay, so 4/4, this is how 4/4 is going to sound. I'm sorry, let me do it like I was doing before. So 4/4, we, instead of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can sort of feel the marchiness to it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's kind of a sort of a determined, you know, kind of determined feel to it. It can have that. Whereas you're not going to have that with one of them that's divisible by 3. Is the short end of it. Okay, so what is this 4/4 going to sound like? The left hand will just do that only. 1, 2, 3, 4. Rather than it's hard to switch back and forth between the two. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so the first part was between 3/4 and 4/4. Then when I did, that'd be 6/8. So I'll do 3/4 and 4/4 again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So hopefully you can hear the difference between the two. Now let's add just a little bit of a right hand. I'm gonna slow down because otherwise I'm gonna run away from myself. Okay. Okay. I think I'm gonna close it up there. So again, 3/4, 6/8, and 4/4. You don't have to start there, but hopefully you can feel and hear and see that they communicate different things because of the way that the beats are arranged in relation to each other. So that's one thing to consider at one point in time while you're writing your piece is what is the general feel and what's the time signature that goes along with that. It will help you keep a consistent time signature throughout and have it be much easier for your listener to follow on that intuitive sort of felt sense of things. Okay, for our next part, now I would like to talk about when you're in one particular key signature and also the actual scale that you're focusing on. Within that scale, what are some notes that you can play around with to even start improvising or composing a piece? Now I'm going to back up for just a second for those of you who have no idea what I just said. If you have, again, we're in the key of C. If you're looking at a piano, this means there's no sharps, no flats that you're going to be playing to stay in that key. Again, if you want to learn more about the differences between keys and what that means, there's, again, other places that can really explain it very well for you. I'd encourage you to take a look at that. But for what you need to know here, in each scale, there's 8 notes, and then it repeats. Okay, so if you're looking at a piano, you'll notice that it's a pattern between the black notes and the white notes, and that's because the notes themselves repeat just at different octaves, so at different levels of low and high, in short, pitch-wise. Okay, so whatever key you're in, you have 8 notes that you can play with. So in the key of C, buzz a little bit, okay? So that's the whole scale, and you have your octave, which is the biggest interval, and they're both C's. So that's the case in C major. If you were in D major, it would go from D to D, E major, E to E, etc. Same with minor keys. If you have A minor, A to A, B minor, B to B, etc. Okay. So let's say that you've picked your key. You know I'm going to do it in C major because that's what we've been working in already. Very, very broadly speaking, your one... Okay, so if you were to take all those notes in the octave and you were to number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe even, I mean, as you're watching this, it might be helpful to just take a look, write it on a piece of paper. You'd write C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and then underneath that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so that's the scale we're working in, C major. And so when I say the numbers, I'm referring to those particular notes. So if I say a 1, I mean C, the first note of this scale. If I say a 3, I'm talking about the third note. So if we have C, B, E, I'm talking about E. If I have the 5, if I say 5, I mean the G. So if I say 1, 3, 5, okay, that's what I'm talking about, those notes. So, okay, if you're working in a major key, what you just heard is probably what I would call the brightest intervals of notes that you could play, a 1, 3, and 5. Now, what I tend to do, and this is what I would recommend that you start with, is you're going to want to stick around at least the 1 and the 5. That's because these are good landing notes. And what I mean by that, part of this is hard for me to explain because there's also just an intuitive part of it that you just sort of feel. And that's a horrible way to explain that. If I was listening, I'd be so frustrated with me saying that because it's like, well, great, that doesn't help me at all. You feel it, but I don't. And so I'm going to try my best to communicate that. There's a lot that I've learned or that I just have an intuitive sense with by God's gift, that I just sort of know when the notes are supposed to change, or I know when I'm supposed to land back on my one note, that's C. But I'm going to try and explain that as best as I can. And what I mean by staying around the 1 and the 5, or the 1, 3, and 5, you could even say, is if you're improving, stay with that. So I'm going to just play a little something on the left hand just to give us a base, again, a sense of the time signature. And then I'm just going to play with the 1 and 3, or even 1, 3, and 5, and I'll give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Okay, so all that except for one note was a 1, 3, or 5. So a C, E, or G. Okay, now when I say play around the notes, what I mean is, say you've gone, that's 1 and 3, just back and forth, 1 3 1 3, and you kind of wanted something a little bit different in there. So what I mean by play around it is literally play the notes around the 3. So for example, excuse me, that's the 5 right there at the top. So I use the 2 and the 4 as sort of complementary coloring to it, because they're not as bright sounding. But I return back to the 1 and 3. And what this kind of does, the best way I can put it, is that it reminds the listener of what key we're in. If I'm just sort of playing random notes, if I'm just like, you have no idea what key I'm in. You have no sense of being able to follow the tune at all. And I think music and writing has a lot to do with the combination between familiarity and newness. And so you don't want to be all over the place. You want to remind the listener, we're in C. We're still in C. We're still in C. We're in a different part of C, but still in C, and returning back to C. And this just is a little tug in a different direction. Back to C. You kind of want to touch back home to home base. It's almost like, I mean, this is maybe sort of a cheesy example, but it's like, it really is like going back home. There's a kind of settling in that the listener, and you as a listener, you're also a listener, here, and you kind of go, okay, we're back. When you return particularly back to that 1, that C in this case. And so you want to stay within the 1, 3, and 5 in large part when you're first getting started with it, because it introduces the listener to this space that you're playing this particular song, and that the home of this particular piece, you could say. And we'll have interest later in the piece. I'll talk about this at the end. Well, where do you go after you play the 1, 3, and 5 for forever? It sounds repetitive. We'll get into that in a second. But again, returning back home, having a little bit of interest. Here's interest here. That's also interest right there, that 2. But if I were to land on that and stay there, if I were to go, it sounds like the piece is supposed to keep going. Now, sometimes you might want that, but for the time being, I would try and create one phrase where you start with the 1 and circle back to the 1. Feel that rest there at the end. It was like, yeah, it was time to come back home. I'm trying to communicate through example also to sort of train your ear. When is it time to come back home? So you want to come back home to that 1, and along the way with your phrases, you want to land on that 5. What I mean by land is usually that it's going to be your longer note. So long note, that's the 3, 5, long note, that's the 1 again. Now, if you're wanting to create a phrase where you want it to feel like there's more coming, you land on that 2. This is just general suggestions. That 2, so not leading. Oh, sorry. That's leading, that's the 2. Okay. So sticking around that 1, 3, and 5, You can also hit this octave. That's a very powerful way to do it too. Again, as a return back home, as a reminder to the listener of what key we're in. Okay. Now, this is true when you're not moving your... Notice I haven't moved my left hand at all. I've just said we're in the key of C in 4/4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Okay? But in a lot of pieces, they're not going to just stay in one key. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But just so you know what your 1, 3, 5, and 8 are going to be during the piece is going to shift as your left hand shifts throughout. I'm trying to think if there's other ways I can explain this even more deeply. So again, 1, 3, 5, sort of your pillars of the piece of the key that you're in. Let me illustrate this with a minor key. We'll go to A minor. So you can tell it's a minor key rather than the major. It sounds quite different. But there's still the same rule. So I'm just going to stay on 1, 3, and 5 for this one, A minor. Okay, but we want a little bit of color in there. As color, it's a really nice color. Okay. As with anything, the best thing to do, and this harkens back to what I said in my general comments, always be listening. And so if you're watching this and you're like, I don't even know what she's talking about. Well, first of all, hopefully that's not the case. But second of all, have your lyre out if you're playing the lyre or your piano or whatever, and start in A minor. And then try and shift just one of these notes up one. So if I take the 5 and move it up to a 6. And then shift it back down. Do that a couple times. Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to do that. Here's the 5. Four. I mean, that's so beautiful. And you can learn that literally just by playing those two. And so just paying attention and really wondering, being curious about the instrument. I've talked about this a few times before, but being curious about the instrument. And that's how I've learned to improvise and compose by and large, much more than thinking about it. Again, as I said before, so start on the 1, 3, 5. That's usually how I start a piece, unless I want it to, I don't know, unless I want something a tiny bit different. But for the time being, for starting, I can't cover everything in one video, but I start with the 1, 3, and 5, and then change a little note. Let's try, instead of the 5, let's try the 3. We'll move the 3 up to 4. So we have 1, 3, 5, 1, 4, 5, sorry. Okay, and now what happens if I just shift both the 3 and 5 up 1, so I have 4 and 6. So I'll do 3 and 5 first, and then 4 and 6. Sorry. See, I mean, that's beautiful. I think it is. And it doesn't take much. It's literally just shifting up 1 on 2 of these. But start with that 1, 3, 5. Move from there and return back to it. It's probably the most simple way I can say it. Start there, move away, and come back. Start at home, go on an adventure, come back home. And I'll loop back around to that at the very end. But I think we're going to stop there for this section. Okay, maybe you've noticed I added in another section. I'd like to talk about one more thing before we jump into the next sections, and that is left hand improvising, you could say. Excuse me. I know I just did a tutorial where I went through Traveler's Path and I said you can improvise on the left hand. So I need to talk about that a little bit. The left hand, you can certainly improvise in some of the ways that I was talking about with the right hand, with the 1-3-5, but your left hand is usually not the melody. And so if you switch up the notes that it's playing too much and it's conflicting with the right hand, it just sounds wrong. It just sounds like you're playing the wrong note. It doesn't sound interesting, whereas in the right hand, it does sound interesting. In those higher notes, it does sound interesting because that's the melody. The harmony is more of a holding space. It's again communicating the time signature and the key signature, and so if that it's sort of your foundation. If you mess with that too much, it's confusing. Okay, so but what I do tend to do in the left hand when I do improvise, if I'm not just playing something super straight like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or like I've been playing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. If I want to do something a little bit more with the left hand, I would vary the rhythm rather than the notes. Things to think about of how to do this. Again, this is also going to sort of be a little bit more felt than anything else, but let me communicate it to you knowledge-wise so that you can consider it, and then as you play, it will also become more intuitive in your hands and in just that interior sense of knowing what's a good rhythm and what's not with the left hand. Okay. So with that, so again, things to think about. The first is that if your left hand is playing at the same time as your right hand, this is going to sound silly, but it's going to be louder, right? Rather than. So it adds some more emphasis on that particular note. So if there's parts of the paragraph, the measure that you are on, or the phrase that you're on that you want to be emphasized, that might be a time for the left hand to come in, whereas maybe you should leave the left hand out if you want there to be less emphasis on a piece or on a part of the piece. So let me give you an example. Let's go to minor. It'll be a little bit better. We're going to be in A minor. So instead of, okay, where the left hand is just creating a steadiness, which for 4/4 I actually find to be quite nice. It has that marching sound to it. But if you don't want that, you could play something a little bit more like this. And so what you'll notice that I did in that is two things. So the first is what I've already said, I actually emphasize that one a lot, that coming back home, that unity in the right and left hand. The other thing that I did, and this is what I did a lot in Traveler's Path, is I played the left hand when the right hand was not playing, and that is just to add some interest. So what I mean by that is when the right hand is like, on this 3, I would do something with the left hand. So okay. So when do you want there to be an emphasis on them both playing together? Where do you want to feel that, I've used this before, but that oomph in the piece, have them play together at that piece, at that point. But if you don't want to have just a steady something, I would add the left hand in when the right hand is resting for a moment, when it has a half note or a whole note or something like that. And not as a competing melody, but just as like a little swirl in the background. A little decoration. It's not competing with it. It's not in line with them. It's not another part of the melody. It's just a little whisper from the background. It's like it stays in the background, and then the melody moves away for a moment. It comes forward for a second, and then comes back. And that can create a very nice sort of mysterious feel to a piece. It can also add. It's just sort of a little decoration for the piece. It also is very helpful if you're improving to, if you don't want to play your hands at the same time, it's much easier to play them separately, and that's a creative way to do that. That's a lot of how I did it at the very beginning, because my brain just couldn't handle all of it at once. So instead of having something on autopilot in the left hand and adding the right on top, I mostly just played the two hands at different points, and they kind of sang back and forth together. Again, I am staying on all of that I've played in the left hand. I've only stayed on the 1, 3, and 5 of that. I almost never deviate. If I do deviate, it's because I'm trying to change to another key. Or if I do deviate, it would be almost exclusively when the right hand is not playing, because it's going to conflict with what the right hand is playing, and again, it's just going to sound wrong and complicated. Okay, so those are the two main things I would recommend for your left hand. When you want an emphasis, have the left hand play at the same time as the right hand. If you're trying to improv with your left hand, or even both hands, but I'm focusing on the left hand on this particular section, play the left hand when the right hand is not playing, and again, stay on that 1, 3, and 5. So that's a few points for that, and I think we'll stick with that little bit for the purposes of this video. Okay, for this next section, what I'd like to talk about is changing keys without changing key signatures. Now, for those of you who don't know what that means, a key signature is how many sharps and flats you have in the piece. So if you were to look at a piece of sheet music and look all the way to the left, at least at the very, very beginning of the piece, if not all the way through, it'll have 1 sharp, 2 sharps, 1 flat, 2 flats, etc., all the way up to 6, 7. I think it's one of those. Anyways, and that tells you're going to play, for example, an F sharp every time you see an F in the piece. And that tells you right off the bat, at least part of the piece is going to be in G, because G major has 1 sharp, and that sharp is F sharp. It may also tell you if it's not in a major key, then it will be in E minor, because E minor also has only 1 sharp, F sharp. But what happens if you want to play in a key that does not share the same key signature? Let me illustrate this. I tuned it in C major because I want it to be as simple as possible. So earlier we were playing in C major. Again, like I said before, no sharps, no flats. But what if I don't want to just stay on these notes? Especially with the left hand, this can sound tiring after a while. Now, it can work, certainly. I mean, a number of my songs stay in just one key in the left hand. But what I think is very helpful to understand is that you can switch between different keys, even though, because obviously we can't switch key signatures because we have our strings tuned to in a certain way. So I can't play an F sharp on this as it stands. I can't play a B flat. I can't play an E flat or a C sharp or something like that. I would need to retune it. But does that mean that I'm stuck only in this key? No. The immediate next key that you could play in would be what's called the relative natural minor. So for C, if you go down 2 strings, 1, 2, you're going to find the natural relative minor, which is A minor. And what that means is that they have the same key signature. So you can play every note of A minor and it's correct. You can only do that with C major and A minor as it's currently tuned. But that doesn't mean that I just have to stay within either C major or A minor. I can think of also very close keys. So the next closest key, if we're looking at sharps, would be G major. There's one sharp, that's F sharp. So what that means in short is that I could play any note on here except F, because it's tuned in F, not F sharp here, and still be in the key of G. So for example, say I've started in C. Okay, we started in C major. We know we can play an A minor. Okay, A minor all the way up to here. Sorry. Now we know we can play in G major also, which is only one string down from A. This you'll see a lot in a number of pieces that I've written, is that especially if I'm starting in a minor, key, if I shift one down, it's automatically a major key. So listen to the difference. That's A minor, G major. I'll play it up here for you. Oops. And that is something I love to do. I love to move back and forth between major and minor. It creates just such a richness in color. With something like lullabies or something I want to sound really sweet, I stick with a major almost exclusively. If I want it to sound more haunting, I stay almost exclusively with minor, though switching to a major and going back to the minor can have a very powerful effect as well. It's kind of that play between light and dark in a certain sense. So that's the case in any key, no matter what you have this tuned to. So for example, if I did have my F sharps in here, if I had my F tuned to an F sharp and I was mainly playing in G major, I said that I could also play in E minor. And if I played in E minor and I shifted down one note or one string so that I started on a D, so rather than EGB, I was playing DFA. That DFA, because it's an F sharp, is going to be D major. So let me say that even more succinctly. If I'm playing in a minor chord, even if you're like, I don't know music theory, but I can hear that's minor, try shifting down one string and back up. And you'll be going from major to minor, major to minor. Okay? So that's something that's very helpful. So we already said we can play in C major, all notes, A minor, all notes, G major, all but one note. And then if we know the relative minor to G major is going to be E, which I've already said a couple of times now. Let me find my E, there's G here. That's E minor. I'll be able to play all notes except one in that one as well. So we now have 4 keys, 2 major, 2 minor, that we can play in. And that's a lot in one. One song that illustrates this well that I think will help, and this is mostly in majors, this is Song for the Little One. Sorry. See how I moved up there? Back down. I went down to A minor there. Oops. Sorry. Okay. Let me try that again for you. I'm not used to playing it this slowly. This is G major because this is G and down here is G. I've just moved it up an octave. And then I return back to that C. I'll talk about that in a sec. Okay, so hopefully you can see in that one I went from, sorry. Okay, so I'm moving all over the place on this. I went from C major to D minor to A minor to G major back to C major. So I am technically playing in different keys with the same key signature. Now, if you have some music background, that's gonna help you a lot. You can consider, oh, what's so if we go in flats, for example, the closest one to C major would be F major with 1 flat, B flat. So we could play around with that. So if you think about that and you play in these different keys, but avoid the ones where there's not an overlap, so you avoid the B flat or you avoid the F sharp, that's going to be really helpful. And that's where, for me, particularly when I'm playing piano, because I can see it visually, my knowledge of the key signatures at different scales is very, very helpful. And I see that very quickly when I'm looking at the piano keyboard. Now, if you don't have that knowledge, this is again where I'd encourage you just to play with it and listen. So say you're in C and you go, okay, I know this is my C. Sorry, here's my C. That's my home bass. What happens if I move up? Sounds kind of minor. Go back to C. What happens if I move down? Okay. Back up. If I want to be an A minor and switch down, we already did that. What happens if I go up? That's a minor, but it's of a different nature. And you could even just go through your whole lyre and play the 1, 3, and 5. And to just get a sense of how different places sound when you're in different keys. This is a little bit hard to go into more detail with if you don't have music theory. But moving between major and minor, I would recommend paying attention to what keys have a very similar key signature, even if it's not exact, and try and play between those, and that can be very, very powerful. So that is more of something that I would consider if you are composing rather than improving, though maybe improving too. On the piano, I do that a lot. It's a little bit harder for me with the lyre, because it's just not an instrument I played as long as the piano. But even so, you could get a feel for it quite intuitively if you spend enough time. So that's my sort of next peg of things to think about when you're composing or improvising, is if you don't want to stay in just the same spot, or if you're really comfortable with that, I would encourage you to switch around in different places with your left hand, because that determines or it sets a foundation for your listener of what key you're in. It cues them into something is changing. So switching that left hand around and moving to different keys, but again, always going back to that home key. And so that's why your key signature is important, because it does indicate that, for example, C is the main key that this piece is going to. And just like I talked about before with the 1, 3, and 5 being a kind of home, particularly the 1, and going to the 4 or the 2 or the 6 or the 7, as something of interest that leads back home, you kind of adventure away and come back home. I talked about that with the specific notes. You can do that with the key as well. So you might go from, A minor to G major to A minor to C major back to A minor, something, I'm just making that up, but something like that. You return back to it, but you deviate to add some interest in there. And so if you put those two together, you deviate in the notes you're playing and you deviate in the keys that you're playing, and you're going to get a lot of interest. It's going to sound very dynamic, even though we're really working with quite limited notes, and we cannot change the key in the middle of the piece, which is different than like a lever harp, certainly than a piano, things like that. So that's a note particularly about the lyre, but for any piece as well. Okay, so we're going to end there for this section. Okay, in this final section, what I'd like to pretty briefly discuss is the overall layout of your piece. This is going to be true for smaller sections of a song and also for larger sections. I say this with a bit of a caveat. This is not to say that every piece is structured this way, but it is a very simple way to structure a piece, and it's a pretty common way to structure a piece. Excuse me, I'm not going to give a specific formula, but just like in like a lot of pop songs, you have a refrain, right? And when that refrain comes back on, it's the same. And maybe there's a little bit of a difference. Maybe, I don't know, the background singers come in and start singing, or maybe the singer sings it an octave higher, or a key, in a slightly different key that's higher, and it sounds more powerful because it's kind of the apex of the piece. But it's still the same refrain. And so you as a listener, definitely by the third time you've heard it, or even the fourth, if they do it a fourth time, sometimes they do, you can just about sing along, at least hum. If nothing else, it's very familiar, and you feel a kind of capacity to participate in the song, and that's very powerful. It's what makes you want to clap your hands or sway back and forth or sing with it or something like that. If the singer was singing something entirely different the entire time, and nothing sounded the same, you feel a little bit lost, a little bit left out. And so music is both, there's a gift in a newness. There's as a listener, you want to be surprised. You don't want to just hear the same thing over and over again. But you also, as a listener, again, want to be able to participate. And so as a musician, you also, in the gift that you're offering of newness, of something wonderful, something beautiful, you also want it to be an open gift where the person feels the space for them to come into it as well. Even if that something is very simple as, if you're in an orchestra, if you're, attending a symphony or an orchestra, you're not going to start clapping your hands, you're not going to start singing along. But you know where the piece is going. And so even having a sense of what the next note is intuitively is a way of being welcomed into the piece in a certain sense. Now, there are some pieces that are very complicated, and so they don't follow maybe like an ABA structure, but they do have returning themes to them. And so that's something, like I said at the very beginning, to keep it simple. So keeping it simple in what it is that you're playing. If you've noticed, the whole video I've been improving, just as I wanted to offer an actual example, but you'll notice that I play a lot of the same things over and over again. Okay, and that's because there's something beautiful about offering something that is familiar to the person, in addition to surprises. So part of what I'm getting at is that the structure of the piece, the way that I tend to structure a lot of pieces is something like your refrain, or what I'll call section A. Then you have B. I'll get into maybe some ideas for B. So you have A, B, and then return back to A to remind the person this is where we started. Remember, this is home. And then going to a part C that you probably only play once, then going back to part B and returning home to A. So A, B, A, C, B, A. I don't do this in every piece. Sometimes there's a few more variations in the piece, but usually, almost always I'll go A, B, A. Now there may be some variation in A. Maybe I have a few extra little added notes in there, but it's still the same melody. So say the melody is, I don't know. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay, do that again. Maybe the next time I play. It wasn't a great example, but it was good enough. What I mean by is that it's just having a few extra notes, but it's still recognizable. That's almost exactly the same as what was already shared with me or played for me at the very beginning. So there can be some variation, but there also doesn't have to be. Again, keep it simple. And even within the phrase itself, to have a lot of repetition in there. Otherwise, it's hard for the person to follow. Now, there are, if you listen to, I was going to say spa music. That's true, but the spa music is just sort of like, it's very unintrusive. So much so that is not meant to be listened to. Not really. It's meant to be in the background and to have create a certain feel in the space. But you wouldn't go to an orchestra and listen to spa music. That just, there's not enough to listen to. And I don't mean anything against spa music. It's just, it's made for a particular purpose, and it's not the same thing as an orchestra or symphony, or even, a solo violin or a solo lyre or a solo piano piece or something like that, where you're writing it in order to communicate something in the song. You're trying to write a song. And so anyways, so with songs that are written to be more in the background, even some movie soundtracks, things like that, or maybe even, video game soundtracks, stuff where there's a story or something going on in the forefront and then there's music in the background. It can be very powerful, but it's not going to follow these same rules because it's trying to not attract your attention. It's trying to add an atmosphere, not to have what you could call a word in and of itself. In that piece, at least in a very strong sense. It can still be very beautiful, but you don't want the story and the music to be competing with each other. And if the music is too talkative, if it's got too much going on in its melody, or it's too recognizable as a person's listening to it, it's going to be distracting. And so that kind of music is going to be different, but that's not what we're talking about here. Having familiarity with that. Okay, so the only other thing I want to speak about here in regards to general structure, so you have A, which is usually going to be in that main key that you're in, right? C. Maybe you'll go to something a little bit different within that, but for the time being, we're going to stick with that. Your part B would be a nice place to shift into a different key to spend some time in there. So maybe I'll shift to A minor in the second part of the piece with some G. And then I'd return back to that C again for that part A. Sorry. So shifting different keys between part A and part B is nice. The other thing that you can consider, particularly in either B or C, is to shift which part of the scale that you're working with. So I've mostly been working with the bottom half of the scale, 1 through 5, 1 through 4, that kind of thing. But what if I, instead of using the bass note, remember I talked about going home to that 1, what if I use the 8 as that instead of the 1? Because remember, they're the same note. Right? They're both C's, it's just they're an octave apart. So say I've, spent my time at home. back home. Now what if I don't change my left hand but jump up here? Right? It almost, I mean, it doesn't sound like a different key, but there's a freshness in what you're hearing, but also a familiarity because you're playing the same note a lot. It's just an octave higher. If you're on a piano, you could, shift up. But with the lyre, it's so limited in regards to how many strings. You got to be really creative, which is one thing I really like about the lyre. And so playing in a different part of this scale as well. So we talked about those numbers 1, 3, 5. So playing around in like 5 through 8. That relationship between 5 and 8, we have. I'm sorry. That's a very happy, light sound. And it's almost reminiscent of the 1, 5. Because, again, those are both C's. So, sort of deviated a little bit from what I was going to talk about, but those are very good. So overall structure of the piece, keep it simple, return back. It's a little bit of a fine balance between newness and familiarity, but it tends to be the case that a lot of people will think that they're being too repetitive in a piece because you're the one hearing it all the time, and you forget that the first time you listen to a piece, you don't hear how repetitive stuff is. The repetition is actually kind of a comforting thing. You feel, again, welcomed into the piece. You feel like you can join in the second half of the piece, even if it's the first time that you've heard it. Very broadly speaking. So return to that, and between the different sections at A, B, C, or D, E, and F, it just sort of depends. Try switching between keys and also the part of the octave that you're playing with. Okay, I'm gonna stop this section here, and then there may be let's do a few concluding thoughts to kind of wrap it all together. I'll kind of summarize a few things. Okay, so a few notes just in conclusion. First, I hope this is helpful for you. Hopefully it's given you a few ideas. Even if you weren't able to catch everything, maybe you lack some music theory background, excuse me. But you do want to play a little bit. You want to write your own stuff, or at least just play around with it. Not always have to be playing a particular piece that you've worked on and you have muscle memory for. But to play around on it, which I'd really encourage. Hopefully this has given you some ideas of how to do that in a way that sounds very beautiful. So just to summarize, we've got our time signature, 4/4, 3/4, 6/8, sets the feel of the piece in regards to sort of the sway of it. You'll also set your tempo at this time, so how fast you're going. The second piece of things being stay around that 1, 3, and 5. Don't forget to come back home to that 1. If you want to lead to something, a 5 can be good. A 2 is particularly good if you want the listener to sort of feel like you need to finish the story. But beginning and ending phrases at that 1 is very helpful and can add some nice consistency to your piece. The third part being you're going to set your lyre in a certain key, but you can play in multiple. You're going to set it in a certain key signature, but you can play in multiple keys. So just experiment with that. With your left hand, be creative with the rhythm. Don't switch up too much on those notes; it'll sound kind of messy. So playing when you want to emphasize something, playing it at the same time as your right hand. And or playing it when your right hand is not playing, and so they kind of have a little conversation between the two. Excuse me. That is if you don't want to simply play the same thing again and again in the left hand, which has its positives and negatives to that. And then finally, I think this was the last thing. Composing your piece, ABA, CBA is one idea. Coming back again, same theme, just on a broader scale, on a broader scope. Returning back home to that key. You can do variations in what key you're playing in, also the part of the key of the scale that you're playing in. And again, just a reminder, kind of back to the beginning. As you get comfortable and as you just play it, which is really the best thing to do, just try it. Just give it a shot. It's going to sound messy at first. You're going to be very limited at first, but just keep playing with it and keep being curious about, well, what happens if I do this? I think that's a great way to grow. It's very much how I got into the lyre, how I got into improv and composition in the first place, is just curiosity. I knew I could play in a certain key, so I played in that key and I played all within it, and learned the different variations, and then switched into different other keys and did kind of the same thing. So being curious, remember just to listen to what it is that you're playing, and also to try and cherish wherever it is that you're at, and what you're able to do. I hope this is helpful. Certainly I couldn't cover everything, but just be playful with it. I hope it's a great deal of fun for you. Let me know in the comments, emails, etc. Things that are helpful, or if there's something certainly in this video that was unclear, or if there's something else I could spend a little bit more time clarifying for you and helping you out on. So I think that's it. Have a blessed day, and God bless. Thanks so much.